Israel. Please see the table, like I said, if you need any additional copies. There will be a special 3 weeks video presentation by Rabbi in Mizrahi. We'll be showing it twice, Sunday morning, July 16th, as well as Tuesday night, July 18th. And we are hoping that once again those videos will be closed captioned for anybody that's hearing impaired. So if you know anybody in the deaf or hard of hearing community, you can please let them know that we will be captioning that video once again along with the CJE. And if there will be a Tisha B'Av this year, hopefully there won't be, but if there will be, then our annual Tisha B'Av lecture by Rabbi Silver will take place here at 3 p.m. on Tisha B'Av. This morning's first year has been sponsored the Ilui Nishmas for Dovid Fink by his wife and children. Dovid Fink was a rabbi in Chicago, New Orleans, Edmonton, and here in Baltimore. He was zilcha to be part of enabling many peoples to become more observant Jews. Even towards the end of his life, he made sure that there was always Torah learning in his house. May this morning's shir be an aliyah for his neshama. It is my honor to introduce Rabbi Dovid Fink, actually the son of Rabbi Dovid Fink, who may want to elaborate on the details that I said. Rabbi Dovid Fink is a practicing trial attorney here in Baltimore. He is a musmach of the Rockaway Five Towns Community Kollel. He has learned on various Jewish topics ranging from comparative secular and Torah law, raising children and shalom bayis, to Torah, hashkafa, and halacha across the United States and in Israel. He is a past president here of B'nai Jacob Sheri Zion and Shemesh in Baltimore. He is married to Chaya Fink and lives in Baltimore with their children. We are fortunate to have Rabbi Fink as a valued member of our faculty, as a frequent contributor to our weekly Dvar Torah project, as well as a speaker at many of our events. Please join me in welcoming Rabbi Dovid Fink back to us.
This is fresh water. All right, I just do my pressing stop when you're done. Okay.
Good morning. So the first time that I'm giving a class here where my mother and family are the sponsors. I guess they couldn't find anyone else today. But in any event, it wouldn't be appropriate to begin without making a mention of my father, who is Lilui Nishmas this year. But I have to say, I don't want to distract too much from the topic of what we're doing here, but I want to tell you just one story with my father that I think is very relevant and directly tied to what we're going to talk about today. This is a story that goes back about 25 years, maybe 22 years, 23 years, but in any event, at that time I had been an attorney for a couple of years, and I had some job opportunities. And a lot of people were trying to recruit me away from my old job, which I was looking to leave anyway, and I had a choice. I narrowed it down to two choices. I had been offered an opportunity to become principal counsel for Travelers Insurance Company in Maryland, Washington, and Virginia. And it was a very big job for someone who was only 2 or 3 years out of school. But unfortunately or unfortunately, I'd had a number of cases with their former principal counsel who was retiring, and he had recommended me for the position. And then I had an opportunity with a medium-sized law firm here in Baltimore, about 30 lawyers. And I really didn't know which one to take. I was leaning a little bit towards the traveler's position, probably because it was more money. But I really hadn't made up my mind. So I went to see my father. And I spoke to him that evening. And I asked him, what do you think, And he said, he says, I don't know which opportunity is better for you, but I will tell you this. He said, I think Travelers Insurance Company is going to do very well whether or not Dovid Fink decides to be their attorney. They're going to make money. They'll be okay. If you take the other job, then you have a chance to go out every day and help people who otherwise may not have help. And he says, for me, that would tip the scales. That's an important lesson, and it's something we're going to talk about today. By the way, I took his advice, and I did go work for that other law firm. It was a wonderful opportunity for me. But in any event, I look back, and had I taken that position with Travelers, I've had a very different life. And that's something we all need to keep our eye on the ball, and I think that's where we're going to end with today. We're going to end today, by the time we get to the end of our hour, with the idea that we all have to find a way to help people. So with that, I'm going to begin with what we're talking about today, and express an hakaras hatov to both my parents for always putting that value in me. So, we're all here about this wit shear for water. And I got at least 6 people came up to me in the last week or so and said, water? That's pretty random. Why not have a wit cheer about Cheerios? I mean, like, and a lot of people didn't quite get what's the significance of water. Frankly, I don't know if wit got the significance of it when they thought of the topic. But there's nothing more profound. Water is at the core of our existence. Did you know that when they send out spacecraft to Mars and to Saturn and these places to see if there's any chance that there ever was life, even bacteria, on any of these foreign planets or anything like that, they search for water. That's what they search for. They can't search to see if there's cuneiform or tablets with a written history. They're looking to see if there was water. Because if there's water, then it's possible life, bacteria, whatever it is, could have been formed, could have been sustained there for a period of time. That's what they look for. And water is no different to planet Earth, but in our world of Yiddishkeit and our world of humankind, there's nothing more central than water. And we're going to talk just one part about that today, and I hope it gives you a flavor for the rest of the shiurim that are coming, because we could talk about topics related to water forever. Today's topic is mostly going to be about rain. That's our topic, about how it's one of the keys that Hashem never lets go of. And I'm going to try through the course of this hour to explore some of the Torah and the Talmudic Gemara sources about rain. But more importantly, we're going to learn a little bit about how to access the spiritual forces which exist and actually allow us to fulfill the Tachlis and the Bria, our Tachlis and the Bria. That's a bit ambitious for an hour, but it's a good crowd. I think we're up to it. Okay? This is going to be a fundamental listen, so buckle your seatbelts and get ready. How many of you have source sheets with you? I just want to know how often I should refer to them. Okay. It's not necessary, but it is helpful if you have them, particularly at the beginning. I am going to read this first source out loud to kind of piggyback on what we just said. For all of you who still aren't convinced about the significance of water, let me tell you this. We're going to talk about this a little bit more detail in a few minutes, but how many of you were cognizant of the fact that all the Avos met their shidduch at a well? Sure. It's not a coincidence. We're told many times in the Midbar about things that Moshe Rabbeinu did for water. It's not a coincidence. We all know what a central role the mikveh has always played in Yiddishkeit, for men and for women. You go back to historic times in Eretz Yisrael, and what do they find when they dig into 2,000-year-old ruins? They find mikvahs all over the place. It's central to who we are. Well, let's look a little bit about that. We're going to start with source A, which is the English here. The English source, I'm just going to read it out loud for those that don't have it, because I think it's a tone setter. The Torah mentions that Avram, the greatest of all who have been strong in faith, worked extremely hard to dig wells of water. He did this because, as mentioned above, water is associated with the spiritual energies of faith. The Ari HaKadosh says that when a well of water is dug, a corresponding spiritual well of water is opened in the upper worlds, which causes the spiritual energies of faith contained in the upper waters to permeate the atmosphere, influencing people to believe in Hashem. I'm not telling you the sources for these first two sources or where they came from. They're not mine, but I want to make sure they invite me back. They are from Kabbalistic Sfarim, but understand that water is probably the most profound connection we have to the spiritual world. For those of you who haven't always been at some of my other shiurim, I'll tell you this just in a nutshell. Everything we do here has a corresponding effect in the spiritual world. Not always the one that we intend, but always an effect. There's a connection between us and the spiritual world. And for whatever reason, I don't pretend to know why or how, water is at the center of that connection. So we know that Avraham dug these wells. And then if you look at the second paragraph to source A, there's a rule that items which share the same spiritual energies are connected at their spiritual roots. As mentioned above, water contains the spiritual energies of faith. Therefore, in order for a man to merit, to find, and properly merge with his mate, creating the proper foundations of marriage, he must first activate the spiritual energies of faith that are contained in water, because it is rooted in the same place as the spiritual energies of faith found in women. Since the unions of Yitzchak, Yaakov, and Moshe would have the greatest impact on the spiritual destiny of the holy nation, it was imperative that their faith be of the purest and highest caliber. Therefore, these couples needed to activate the highest levels of faith possible, which could only be derived from underground waters. And it goes on to quote the Zohar, which in full says that that's one of the main reasons that they had to meet at wells. This was not a random chance occurrence, but rather the waters, specifically the underground waters, have a deep connection to spirituality. Okay, so now that we've got that as kind of a background, instead of spending an hour convincing you of it, I told you some people who really know what they're talking about that say it. Let's look at the source B. And just let's explore this question a little bit. I underlined the relevant portions in source B. It's right at the bottom. It says, V'chol ha'be'eros asher chafru avdei aviv b'mei Avraham aviv, all the wells which were dug by Avraham in his lifetime, sitmum pelishtim vayimalum afar. The Pelishtim came and filled them up with dirt. Now, let's think about that for a second. We're talking about a period of time when life was about really one thing, survival. People had to have enough food to survive. They had to have water to water their crops. They had to have some type of security so that they wouldn't be killed. But that was basically it. Water was the most valuable commodity on planet Earth. Wars were waged over access to wells. And here the Pelishtim are filling up the wells that Avram Avinu dug shortly after they took possession of that land. Now tell me, when you read those psukim, something's got to, wait a second, why would they do such a thing? Why would the Pelishtim, why would anyone for that matter, fill up a well? Thousands of hours of manpower were spent digging a well in the hope that it might bring forth water. It's the most valuable commodity on planet Earth. People had no use for gold unless there was water to buy it with. And people are going and filling up the wells with dirt. So understand there's something much more profound going on here, and there is, frankly, no other explanation. They didn't fill up the wells because they were afraid Spot, the dog next door, was going to fall down and get stuck. Okay? They filled up the wells because everybody understood that wells and underground water were conduits of spirituality. And the Pelishtim did not want that spirituality in the world. They wanted to go about their merry way, living their merry lives, without having to worry about this whole God thing. How inconvenient that was. And we see it today with the spirit of atheism and all types of other things which are really just modern manifestations of Zrikas Ol. Zrikas Ol, throwing off the yoke of Hashem, has always been part of the Bria. This is the core of where it starts. The idea that people are willing to throw away and discard and forever block a life-giving commodity like water to the extent that they would fill up the well with dirt so that they didn't have to be bothered by God's influence in our world. So through all the shiurim that you're going to listen to from Witt over the next few weeks about water, keep that in the back of your mind. Water is not just something we drink. Water is not just something that provides moisture for our crops to grow so that we have food to eat. Water is at the core of spirituality and physicality. It's one of those few things that has a dual role and really exists in both worlds. So keep that in mind, whoever is talking to you about whatever topic it happens to be. So let's now get started on the narrow part that I'm going to focus on about water for today. So I'm going to ask you, first of all, we're going to start with one of the most controversial, misunderstood and discussed Gemaras that there are. It's source 1 on your sheet, and it's a Gemara in Tainus, and this is a Gemara by Rav Yochanan. Rav Yochanan was one of the most fundamental Amoras in the Gemara. He's most often seen with his common arguments with Reish Lakish, not here. Rav Yochanan was a very, very big person. And he starts with this Gemara, you'll see it underlined, and he says, Gimel maftechos biyado shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's 3 keys that are in the hands of Hashem. Shelo nimsru biyad hashliach, that he never gives over to a messenger. Ve'elu hein. These are what they are. Mafteach shel geshamim, the key of rain. Mafteach shel chaya, the key to life. Mafteach shel tchias hamesim, and the key of resurrecting the dead. So let's just stop there for a second. So there's hundreds of keys, but the Gemara is saying that of all these keys, there's 3 of them that Hashem never gives over to a shliach. Hashem retains direct control at all times over them because they're so important, so valuable, so profoundly influential that he himself keeps his hand on them at all times. The key of rain, which you'll see later on, is exactly the same thing as Parnasa. The Gemara uses rain and Parnasa interchangeably. Second is the key of Chaya, the key of birth. And third is the key of Tchiyas HaMesim. So basically what the Gemara is telling us, what Rabbi Yochanan is telling us at the outset, is that Hashem retains all the keys that relate to life. He holds the keys of birth, he holds the keys of sustenance, of taking care of us while we are alive, and he holds the keys of Tchiyas HaMesim. These are the three keys that are the quintessential core keys that Hashem never relinquishes to anyone. That makes sense, right? Does that make sense? Everybody think those are profound keys that Hashem should hold on to, right? Okay. There's only one problem with that Gemara. Well, let me say that again. There's about 315 problems with that Gemara, but let's focus on one of them for a second. We are told several places in Chumash and in Navi that it just ain't so. It's a problem. So let's look first of all. Source number 2. This is a story from Malachim Aleph about a person who was dying and their neshama had left them. And comes along Eliyahu Hanavi, and he brings him back to life. You've all heard the story of Eliyahu Bahar Kamel. We all know that Eliyahu on multiple occasions brought people back to life. It's a pasuk in Malachim. So what's Rabbi Yochanan talking about? 1,000 years after Malachim was written, comes along Rabbi Yochanan in the Gemara and says, Hashem never relinquishes the key for Tchiyas HaMesim. Really? So let's just get our black magic marker and get rid of that pasuk in Malachim. We're going out of our minds. Are you kidding me? We see a plain black and white pasuk that says Eliyahu resuscitated the dead. Rabbi Yochanan says it doesn't happen. It's one of those keys that's only in the hands of Hashem. Problem? It's a problem. It gets worse. Let's look at the next source, still part of source number 2, because apparently my pen wouldn't write the word 3 legible enough. But at the bottom of the page where you see sources 1 and 2, it's a page from Malachim Beis, and you'll see several passages underlined. Vayosem es ha-mish'enes al pnei hanar, ve'ein kol, ve'ein kesher, v'yoshev l'kraso. This little boy was dying. Vayagid lo loimer lo hekitz na'ar. This boy will not get up anymore. Vayavo Elisha habaisa. Elisha the Navi comes. Vayispal Hashem mishkavo mitaso v'yigar alav v'yichar sham b'yad. And he brings life back into him. Elisha! We're not even talking Eliyahu Navi, we're talking a second tier Navi now, because Elisha didn't go to Shemayim and back and forth, so he's not quite on the level of Eliyahu Navi, but he's still bigger than you and me. Elisha the Navi also did Tchiyas HaMesim on somebody. What are we talking about? This is Rabbi Yochanan is just talking cliche. Rabbi Yochanan didn't mean what he says. Rabbi Yochanan couldn't be more clear when he says in the Gemara that only Hashem can do Tchiyas HaMesim, and he never gives that key over to anyone. Well, footnote, except Eliyahu and except Elisha. Maybe Rabbi Yochanan didn't know about those psukim. I mean, what are we talking about? Rabbi Yochanan didn't know about... Rabbi Yochanan is going to tell us psukim in a few minutes where he gets this thing from, but apparently he's not troubled by these psukim which tell us about Eliyahu Navi and Elisha performing Tchiyas HaMesim. It gets better. Go to source number 4. Source number 4 is one we'll get back to a couple of times, and there's a lot of passages underlined here, and rather than read and translate them all out loud, let me just say like this. Source number 4, at the end, the third one on the page, says, V'amartel and ko amar Hashem, Hine ani poseach es kivroseichem, v'alesi eschem mikvroseichem ami. And he goes on and he says to Elisha, he tells Elisha, you go and raise this whole valley of bones, of dead people. And, I'm sorry, not Elisha, Yecheskel. Hashem instructs Yecheskel where he's standing. There's a valley of bones here, and I want people to see that I can do Mechiyas HaMesim. I want people to see that I can do it on a wholesale level. And he instructs Yecheskel to say certain things, whatever, and a whole valley of people rises from the dead. So it's not just Eliyahu Navi, it's not just Elisha on a lucky day, it's Yecheskel. 3 different places where specific Nevi'im are referenced as having performed Tchias HaMesim. It's a big problem. It's a big problem. How do we understand Rabbi Yochanan? Rabbi Yochanan is very clear that some of these keys are only in the hands of Hashem. So, obviously, Rabbi Yochanan is a lot bigger than you and me, so we're not just going to throw his Gemara to the side, Chas v'shalom. We're going to try and figure out what he was trying to say. So let's go back to the Gemara for a second on source number 1 on page 2, and try to figure out perhaps what Rav Yochanan was trying to tell us. So if you look at the top of this source sheet, which has source number 1 at the top, you'll see a little bit about those psukim we were reading. It says, Gimel Maftechos Biyado, and if you go down further, it says, Mafteach Shel Geshamim, the second line from the bottom of that source. The key of rain, and it says the key of all these things in Hashem, it says, Mafteach Shel Geshamim on the third line, Mafteach Shel Chaya, and then you'll look to the right, you'll see in small print, it has a source. Rabbi Yochanan doesn't just say this out of his own thought process, he has a source. And he tells you, the Gemara always does this when the Gemara quotes a pasuk, when the Gemara is referencing a pasuk, it tells you where the pasuk is found. So the pasuk that Rabbi Yochanan says, we see this idea that Geshamim, rain, is only found in the hands of Hashem, is from Devarim Chaf Ches. So let's look at Devarim Chaf Ches for a second. You'll find Devarim Chaf Ches 2 places on your 3rd source sheet. It is source number 5 and source number 7. We're just going to look at source number 5 right now. Source number 5, at the top of the page, it says, Yiftach Hashem lecha es otzaro, hatov es hashemayim, loseis mitar artzecha. This is one of the pasuk that Rabbi Yochanan relies on for this idea that the keys of Geshem are always in the hands of Hashem and never in the hands of a shliach. And that's what the pasuk says. The pasuk says that when you go into Eretz Yisrael, I, in the first person, will open up the Shemayim for Geshem and I will water the land for you. So that's Rabbi Yochanan's source. Okay, so at least Rabbi Yochanan has something to go on. Let's look back at the Gemara, source number 1 for the second source. It says the source for Chaya. What's the source for Chaya? Is in Bereshis. Bereshis Lamed, which if you look is source number 6, which I've underlined for you. And it says, Vayiskor Elokim es Rachel, Hashem remembered Rachel, Vayishma Eleha Elokim, Vayiftach es Rachma. He opened up her womb. She had formerly been unable to have children. Vatahar Vatelet Ben Vatomer Yosef. We know the rest of the story. And this is Rabbi Yochanan's second source. When I told you the Mafteach of Chaya, the Mafteach of life, the Mafteach of childbirth, is always in the hands of Hashem and never in the hands of the Shliach, this is where I got it from. This pasuk where it says that Rachel, who formerly could not have children, Hashem opened up her womb so that she could have children. Okay, good. The third source is again in Yecheskel, which we're going to get back to, that same long part of Yecheskel from before. So we see that Rabbi Yochanan has sources. Rabbi Yochanan has a reason for saying what he said. Of course, we knew that, but we didn't know what it was. Now we know what it was. Rabbi Yochanan's not going to Malachim. Rabbi Yochanan's not going to Yecheskel. He's going to Psukim and Devarim and Bereshis, which say that Hashem has these keys in his hands, that he does this personally. He does not do them through a shliach. Well, I feel better that I know Rabbi Yochanan's sources now, but now I'm left with a conflict. Rabbi Yochanan's sources seem to be in conflict with the Navi, Elisha, the Navi in Malachim, and the Navi in Yecheskel, which says that various Nevi'im over time performed Tchias HaMesim. So which is it? What's going on here? Is this a key that Hashem always keeps in his pocket that only he uses? Or does he sometimes give it to Elisha, sometimes give it to Eliyahu HaNavi, sometimes give it to Yecheskel and others? Those are just 3 sources that we see where Hashem gave this mafteach over to other people. What's going on? It seems to be a conflict, or a defective limud by Rav Yochanan. Because it would be very easy to say that while Rav Yochanan has psukim to support his view, those psukim do indicate that Hashem controls rain. those psukim do indicate that Hashem controls childbirth, but those psukim do not say that he never gives it over to the hand of a shliach. That's Rabbi Yochanan's limud. So we could say either, it's a defective limud or it's a conflict. Either one is not very satisfying to me, and frankly, it's not possible. You don't make it into the Gemara if you haven't thought about those things. But on the surface, it seems to be a problem. So let's go back now a little bit. I told you we were going to have two psukim in Devarim, which we were going to reference, source number 5 and source number 7. So now we're going to go to source number 7, which actually comes before source number 5. Source number 5 is where Hashem tells us, Yiftach Hashem l'chos otzara. I will open the Shemayim and I will provide rain and I will provide moisture for your crops to grow. But look at source number 7, which comes earlier in that same parak. What does it say? It says, V'haya im shamoa tishma b'kol Hashem elokecha. If you listen to the voice of Hashem, lishmar la'asos es kol mitzvosav. If you follow all the mitzvahs, if you do what you are supposed to do, then I will open up Shemayim and I will provide for you rain. Okay. So we have a little bit of a second part to that source now. Rabbi Yochanan may not just be referring to the idea that the pasuk says that Hashem will provide rain for you. He may also be referring to the part of the parak that says, if you keep the mitzvahs, then I will provide rain for you. And let's look at source number 8. Source number 8 is again a pasuk which precedes the part of the parak with Rachel where it says Hashem remembered her tsar and remembered her and opened up her womb so she could have children. What does it say before that? It says, Vatomer el Yaakov, this is Rachel speaking, Havi libanim, bring me children to have. If I don't have children, it's like I'm dead. This is Rachel pleading with Yaakov Avinu, saying, daven for me. Please daven for me that I should have children, because if I don't have children, it's like I'm dead. That's what precedes, by several psukim, this idea that it says in the pasuk, Vayiskar Elokim es Rachel, that Hashem remembered Rachel. Before Hashem remembered Rachel, she was crying out, and she was suffering. And that's what we see in source number 8. So there's a key here that makes a difference. And it's one of the main keys I want you to get out of today. Yes, it's true. These maftechos, these keys are always in the hands of Hashem. But what we do matters. We have that already from the source numbers 1 and 2, the idea from Kabbalistic sources that when we do something, it matters in the spiritual world. Every time we do something, it has an equal and opposite reaction in the spiritual world. It has an effect, which we often don't see, we often don't know, but it does. That's what the Kabbalistic sources tell us. And these psukim are really telling us the same thing, which is at the root of what Rabbi Yochanan was trying to tell us. Yes, it's true. These maftechos are in the hands of Hashem. But it's our actions that trigger them. Those keys are there for Hashem, and it's His control. But we determine when He uses them. Now, can Hashem create a nace at any time? Of course. That's not the issue. If Hashem wanted to run a world where we had no influence, no bechira, no anything, that's the world of the malachim. Malachim have no bechira. But in our world, what we do matters. And that's what these psukim and Rabbi Yochanan is telling us. Are there keys that are in the hands of Hashem? Is everything in the hands of Hashem? Of course. But our actions decide when various forces are brought to bear, when various keys are used to unlock various doors. That's through us. It's through Rachel's tefillah and her suffering. It's through our following the mitzvahs that the rain comes. Those psukim which indicate that Rav Yochanan's talking about are not psukim that exist in a vacuum, where it simply says that Hashem had these maftechos. Rav Yochanan expected that when people learned his Gemara, they would actually go back to the psukim that he references and see that there's a two-part process. When Rav Yochanan says that these keys are always in the hands of Hashem, he didn't expect you to read one pasuk in a vacuum where it says, Vayiskar Elokim es Rachel. He expected you to look at the pasuk, which was 6 psukim earlier, and see that what triggered that mafteach to be used by Hashem on Rachel's behalf. He expected you to go back and see that what triggered it was Rachel's tefillah, was Rachel's asking for Yaakov's tefillah. That what Rachel did triggered Hashem and the spiritual world to use that koach. That's what Rav Yochanan expected. So it's no question by Elisha and by Eliyahu. Of course, Hashem can use Paro to fulfill a mission of Rishus. Hashem can use us to perform a mitzvah of Rachamim. Hashem has different tools at his disposal. Who decides to be that tool at any given time is up to us. And just like Paro was punished for choosing to be the tool through which Bnei Yisrael were enslaved, we can be the tool through which we are rewarded for helping fulfill Hashem's will. Think about this, though. This is not some random idea that I'm coming up with. It's a nice way to figure out the psukim. Great. I appreciate it. It's wonderful. Look through the Chumash, though. Hashem wants to create a makkah of dam. Does Hashem create a baskol from Shemayim and then tell Paro, here comes the blood? No. It's always done through Moshe or Aaron. Sometimes it's something as simple as raising the staff, sometimes stretching out their hands. But there's always an act of man involved to bring about the action of Shemayim. The water wants to come from a rock in the Midbar. How many people have seen water flow from a rock? There you have Nisim like Kriyas Yamsuf, all these Nisim that the Torah references. Every single one of them was precipitated by an action of man. Every single one. Sometimes Moshe, sometimes Aaron, sometimes it's a tefillah, sometimes it's an action, sometimes it's a staff. But it's always triggered by what we do. Nobody can leave this room today without understanding this fundamental idea. What you do matters. It matters on a huge global spiritual world scale. You may not see it, you may not realize it, you may not even know the connection, but it matters. Every one of us has that koach in our hands to access these keys in Shemayim. Every one of us. And these are the biggest keys. Forget about the smaller keys that Hashem does give over to a shliach sometimes. These are the big keys, the keys to life, which Hashem never gives to anyone. That's true. He never gives over the keys to anyone. But he allows us to access them, and he allows us to decide when he's going to use them. Crazy idea, isn't it? Hashem's making us part of himself. We can actually access when Hashem is going to give a refuah to somebody, when Hashem's going to bring a child into the world. We have unbelievable koach at our hands. Is that crazy? That we have it's one thing to say that Hashem never gives it over to a shliach. But to come 180 degrees and say that not only does, in fact, Hashem allow a shliach to access these keys, he allows anyone. Any one of us can access these keys. How do we understand that? That's really radical. And that's what we're going to get into now. So I said this, I don't remember if I said it here, I think I said it somewhere else, but some of you may have heard it from me before, but it's worth hearing again, because this point needs to be driven home. Dovid Fink's a relatively nice guy, but, there's a lot of other people come in here and tell you different things, and, maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong. Okay. It's almost sacrilegious, but I don't want you to take my word for it. There's a Ramban at the end of Sefer Shmos. And again, I hope you all did buckle your seatbelts before we got in here, because this is life-changing. And if it's not life-changing, you should hear it again. The Ramban describes an age-old question of why tefillah works. It's really kind of crazy. The Ramban goes on this idea of the word for ani is I, and the word anochi also means I. Anochi is typically reserved for Hashem, and ani is typically reserved for me, referring to humans. And the Ramban is troubled by this idea. Why do we need two separate words to say the same thing, number one? And number two, they have the same shoresh. They both come from an, aleph nun, ani and anochi. So there's clearly a relationship between these two words, which both mean I. Why do we have these two words, and why do they have a similarity? So again, this is rather profound, and it was life-changing for me, and I think it should be life-changing for you. The Ramban says the reason Ani and Anochi are related to each other is because human beings are the part of Hashem that can exist in this world. Again, a little bit Kabbalah stuff here for you, but it's rewarding. I know it's a crazy idea, but this is what the Ramban says, that we are the part of Hashem that can exist in this world. We understand from various Kabbalistic sources, again, primarily the Ramban and the Zohar and others, that when Hashem wanted to create the world, there was a problem. Because if Hashem was here, fully revealed in front of us, there'd be no room for anything else. His power, his presence would overpower everything to the point where there'd be nothing else. It's an overall, over-encompassing presence and force. So in order for Hashem to allow the world to exist, to create a world, Hashem had to partially withdraw himself from our world. Kind of, some places it's referred to in the Chumash as behind a curtain. In other sources it's referred to as Hashem put layers between him and our world to shield him from our world. But obviously if Hashem was here in all of his honor and glory, there'd be no room for us. And Hashem wanted the world to exist, so he had to partially withdraw. When I say partially, it means 99.9999 from our world. So there'd be this small area for our world to exist. And what the Ramban is saying, and the Kabbalistic Svarim say this as well, is that although Hashem withdrew from our world, a part of him is left behind. Some people refer to it as shadows, other people refer to it as an imprint, but there's part of Hashem left behind in everything. There's godliness. And what the Ramban is saying is that we are the physical manifestation of Hashem. Hashem is a spiritual creature. We don't have any idea of what that means or what Hashem really is. What we do know is that Hashem created us b'tselem Elokim, in his image, and we are the part of Hashem, the 0.0001% of Hashem that can exist in this world that's left behind after he withdrew. And with this Ramban, you can understand something very profound about tefillah. Did you ever wonder why tefillah works? I mean, the whole idea of tefillah is really kind of strange. We have this perfect being that we call Hashem, who at all times weighs everything, considers the ramifications of everything, and comes to a perfect decision. But somehow, we see it in the Chumash with Moshe Rabbeinu and others, and we see it with us. There's this idea that through our tefillos, we can change his mind. We can change the decree that Hashem has already made through his perfect judgment. Now, how can that happen? That almost implies that the judgment wasn't perfect in the first place. How can we possibly, or that it ends up being imperfect? How can we possibly change the mind of Hashem? How can any external force act on Hashem to the point where he now rethinks what he already decided? That's not possible. But with this Ramban, it makes perfect sense. We are not an external force having an influence on Hashem. We are part of the force. We are inside. We are just like Hashem has a midas harachamim, and Hashem has midas hadin, and Hashem has all these other attributes that all factor into his decision. We are a very small part of that brain, whatever that means. We are a small part of the thought process. Yes, there's midas harachamim, midas hadin, and all types of other midas that Hashem takes into consideration when making a decision, to figuring out what's a perfect decision in that situation. We are part of those midos. And that's why our tefillos matter. We have an impact. Our impact is not one of an external force. Our impact is one of being inside, again, lahavdil, the head of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're inside. We have a direct impact on Hashem, just like midas harachamim, just like midas hadin. That's the power of our tefillah. And that jives very well with what we're talking about over here. Yes, it's true, Vayizkar Elokim es Rachel. Hashem remembered Rachel, like he forgot. But look at the psukim that come before that. What made him remember Rachel? What made him remember that she didn't have any children? What made him remember is where it says, Tomer el Yaakov, Hakal Libanim, I want to have children. Otherwise, it's like I'm dead. That suffering, that asking for Yaakov to cry out on her behalf had an impact. The impact of Rachel's crying out made a difference. The psukim in Kisavo from Devarim, which Rav Yochanan cites, what does he say? Yes, Hashem has the mafteach of rain, and He will bring it to water your crops, and He will make sure that you have moisture and ample water to drink. But why and when? V'haya im tishma. If you keep the mitzvos of Hashem through your actions are having an impact on the spiritual world. Those are the two forces that you have to come out of today understanding. You have to understand that your tefillah and your actions have an impact on the spiritual world. Your tefillos and your actions have an impact on accessing the powers of Hashem, nothing less. So let's try to figure out now a little bit of where we go from here. We said it was ambitious. It's a little ambitious, but in a little under 30 minutes, we did manage to understand now how the spiritual world works. Not bad for a morning. So let's talk now more about this idea that we just figured out. This idea that our actions and our tefillah matters. What do we do with this awesome power? How do we know what has a positive impact on the spiritual world? How do we know when we walk out of here today what to do that can actually help us access those keys in a positive way? Well, let's go back to another Gemara. This is source 11. At the top of the page, this is a Gemara in Shabbos. And you'll meet an old friend of ours again. Kama Rabbi Yishmael beno shel Rabbi Yochanan. And what does Rabbi Yochanan tell us a few words later? Bishum delo be'inan zakeli va'anvehu. Words that we say in Shabbos Shira, words that we say by Shiras Hayam. Zakeli va'anvehu. These words which mean that this is our Hashem and we want to exalt Him, beautify Him, publicize His greatness. This is what Rabbi Yochanan is telling us in this Gemara, where he says a little further on, and we're going to get to that in a second, where Rabbi Yochanan tells us that that's our tachlis. Our tachlis is to do va'anvehu, to provide the majesty of Hashem publicly for all people to see. To let the goyim, and there's various places we've talked about in the past, where you see from the psukim and devarim that Hashem cares what the goyim say. Where do you see that? Hashem cares what the goyim think. There's times in the Midbar where Moshe Rabbeinu says, what are the goyim going to say if you kill Bnei Yisrael in the Midbar? They're going to say you didn't have the power to take them into Eretz Yisrael. What does Hashem care what the goyim think? He cares. That's the idea of making a Kiddush Hashem, of publicly making the goyim aware of Hashem's presence and His greatness. That's part of our job. Hashem cares. And this is what Rabbi Yochanan says, Zakeli va'anvehu. This is our Hashem, and this is what He's all about. This is how we publicize, and this is how we tell people about His greatness. And go a few lines further in source 11, and comes the knockout punch. How does Rabbi Yochanan say we do this? Va'anvehu havidomalo mahu. We do this by copying, by emulating, by duplicating what Hashem is. When we show the world and the Ummah Ha'olam how Hashem acts and what Hashem is about, we are publicizing Him. We have a mitzvah in Chanukah of Persumei Nisa. Why do we do Persumei Nisa? What's the idea of publicizing a nace? To show Hashem's greatness. And comes along Rabbi Yochanan here in the second place on source 11, and he says, Mahu Chanun v'rachum, af atah haya chanun v'rachum. Just like Hashem is a chanun v'rachum, is a merciful one and a kind one, so should you be. By doing things which emulate the core midas of Hashem, of rachamim and of chesed, you are providing the tool to performing the mitzvah of zakeli v'anvehu, of publicizing Hashem's name. This is how the Gemara and Rabbi Yochanan is telling us how you do Persumei Kiddush Hashem, how you publicize the greatness of Hashem. It's nothing more complicated than simply being a good person, being a chanun v'rachum, to being a kind and a merciful person, by caring for somebody else, by doing something which cares for somebody else. You are emulating the midos of Hashem, You are actually publicizing his greatness because we are part of him. Like the Ramban said, when we do these things, people see that, oh, these are God's people and this is how they act. This must be what God is. And to drive it home with one more point, let's look at source number 12. And this is a Gemara in Yevamos. It's a day of 3, apparently. This Gemara says, Shalosha simonim yesh b'umazu. There are 3 signs of people that are in this nation. For those of you who come to any of my other classes in the past, you'll know that I often refer to a similar passage in the Shulchan Aruch, which translates the fingerprints, the DNA indicators of a Jew. What are those 3 things? It comes from this Gemara. Shalosha simonim yesh b'umazu. This nation, my chosen people, have 3 signs that you can identify them by. Harachmanin v'habashanin l'gomle chasadim. They're merciful, they're humble, and they do chesed. These are my people. This is how you will know them. This is how you will recognize them. This is Hashem's instruction on this topic of how the world can identify a Jew. I didn't print it up for you. The Gemara goes on to crazy stuff here. The Gemara says a person can eat bread on Pesach, a person can eat on Yom Kippur, and he's still a Jew. But if he doesn't do these 3 things, he may not even be Jewish. That's how crazy it gets, folks. This has to be a game changer. That's what the Gemara is telling us right here. That's what Rav Yochanan's been telling us before from an hour ago. It's about how to access the keys in Shemayim. And how do we access those keys? By doing good things and by being mispalo through tefillah. Why do those things work? Because we're part of the process. And why does Hashem care? Because he had to partially withdraw from this world so that we could exist, so our world could exist. But the tachlis of the Bria is still that people should know Hashem and people should understand his ways. And how does that happen? It happens by his chosen people carrying out his midos, by carrying on the way he does things, by doing things in the manner he would want us to do them, that he would do them if he were here completely. If this was a spiritual world with malachim, we all would do Hashem's bidding all the time. That's all we would do. We would have no bechira. But the fact that we have bechira allows us to busy ourselves with many other things, but it doesn't change the core tachlis of what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be accessing the keys from Hashem through our actions and through our tefillos. And with that, we can finally understand perhaps this other conflict which we live with. Many of you have probably heard of the Gemara, which says that a person doesn't sprain his little finger without it being the will of Shemayim. Okay, nice idea. That almost sounds like we're rats in a maze on a pre-programmed plan again, that we have no bechira, that everything's from Shemayim. No. And the Rambam makes this very clear in many places. The Rambam says, everything that happens, happens because we made it happen. Otherwise, there'd be no schar v'onesh. It would make no sense. And the Rambam brings dozens and dozens of rayas from this. What does the Rambam say? The Rambam says, for example, it says when Cain killed Hevel, it says, Kol demei achicha, all the bloods of your brother are crying out to me from the graves. Says Rashi, who's crying out from the graves? So Rashi says these are the descendants that Hevel never had. The children that were never born to Hevel because Cain murdered him. What are we talking about? Hevel never had any children. He was killed. What children that would have been born, that should have been born? It wasn't part of the cheshbon of Shemayim. That's why Hevel died. Remember, a person doesn't sprain his little finger without it being the will of Hashem. So Hevel couldn't have been killed by Cain unless it wasn't the will of Hashem. Wake up, folks. That's not what it means. And the Rambam makes that very clear. And what we talked about today drives that point home. We control the levers that are pulled. Hashem at all times has shlita over the world. Hashem could perform a nace at any given time and split the Yam Suf again right now in our time. And Hashem can rescue people from the World Trade Center, and he create a milchama in Eretz Yisrael where nobody gets killed, where it's Rabbi biad me'atim. Hashem can do those nisim anytime he wants to. But on a day-to-day basis, Hashem does not interfere with Teva. He allows our decisions to dictate what happens day-to-day in the world. What we do changes everything. You can't come out of here today and simply say, I'm going to go to the next year about water. I'm coming out of here today and understanding that what I do, the actions that I take, the davening that I do, the caring that I do, matters. And I have a whole day in front of me to start with, a whole week in front of me till the next year. Several months until Rosh Hashanah. We have all these powers at our fingertips every day. So Hashem's power is there for us. All we have to do is take advantage of it. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.